Join me as I dive into the most daring prison break of World War II and see if I can figure out how they pulled it off. The year is 1944. Europe is burning under the shadow of the Second World War. Millions are trapped in a conflict that seems endless, and for those captured behind enemy lines, life has become a slow march of monotony, fear, and survival. But inside one prison camp, a group of men refuse to surrender their spirit. They are airmen, pilots, soldiers, men who once ruled the skies but now live behind barbed wire fences, watched by armed guards, and surrounded by walls that were said to be escape-proof. This camp was called Stalag Luft III, built deep in Nazi-occupied Poland. To the German High Command, it was a fortress, a place from which no prisoner could escape. To the men inside, however, it became something very different, a battlefield of ingenuity, courage, and defiance. They were determined not only to break free, but to break the enemy's confidence in the idea of captivity itself. On the cold night of March 24, 1944, that determination was tested. Beneath the surface of the camp, hidden from the eyes of the guards, a tunnel had been carved, longer, deeper, and more dangerous than any attempt before it. 76 men would crawl through the dirt and emerge into the forests beyond the camp's fences. It was a plan so daring, so ambitious, that it would later be remembered as one of the most remarkable escape attempts in human history. But this was not a story of simple victory. What began as a triumph of human spirit soon became a tragedy of unimaginable scale. Of the 76 who escaped, only 3 would reach freedom. The rest were hunted, captured, and in many cases, executed by the Gestapo in brutal defiance of international law. The world would come to know this episode as the Great Escape, a tale of brilliance, bravery, and sacrifice. In this documentary, we will retrace the steps of those men. We will explore how they lived inside Stalag Luft III, how they planned their tunnels in secrecy, and how they overcame the impossible with nothing more than their bare hands, stolen tools, and relentless determination. We will follow their journey from the moment the first shovelful of dirt was dug, to the night of the escape, and finally to the chilling aftermath that shocked the world. Along the way, we will uncover the lessons this story left behind, lessons of courage, resilience, and the true cost of war. This is not just a tale of men breaking out of a prison. It is a story about the human will to resist, even when hope is all but lost. This is the story of the Great Escape. To understand the Great Escape, we must first understand the prison that tried to hold it. Stalag Luft III was not just another prisoner of war camp. It was a fortress, carefully engineered by the German Luftwaffe to contain one very specific group, Allied airmen. The men who once soared in Spitfires, Lancasters, and B-17 flying fortresses now lived in confinement, behind rows of barbed wire and under the watchful eyes of guards who saw them as dangerous assets to be contained. The camp was located near the town of Sagan, in what was then Nazi-occupied Poland. Its location was no accident. Dense forests stretched for miles in every direction, making escape on foot nearly impossible. The ground itself was sandy and unstable, chosen deliberately to expose any attempt at tunneling. If prisoners dug into it, the bright yellow sand would contrast against the surface soil, giving away their plans. To the German High Command, Stalag Luft III was escape-proof. To the Allied prisoners, it was a challenge waiting to be overcome. Construction began in 1942. The camp was divided into compounds, each surrounded by double barbed wire fences and overlooked by tall wooden watchtowers. Guards with machine guns patrolled constantly, their eyes trained to spot even the slightest sign of resistance. Floodlights illuminated the camp at night, and seismographs were buried into the ground, designed to detect the faintest vibrations of tunneling below. It was a prison built not just to hold men, but to break their spirit. But the Luftwaffe underestimated the determination of the men they captured. Inside the huts of Stalag Luft III lived hundreds of Allied officers, pilots from Britain, Canada, America, Australia, New Zealand, and other Allied nations. They were highly trained, resourceful, and fiercely committed to continuing the fight, even from behind bars. For them, escape was not only about freedom, it was about duty. Every man who tried to break out tied up German resources, distracted enemy forces, and reminded the world that the spirit of resistance was alive. Conditions inside the camp were harsh but survivable. Prisoners were given thin rations, mostly bread, watery soup, and occasional scraps of meat. The huts were cold in winter, unbearably hot in summer, and filled with lice. Yet the men adapted. They organized themselves with military discipline, forming escape committees, assigning roles, and even creating a secret economy of trading goods. Red Cross parcels, containing essentials like powdered milk, chocolate, and cigarettes, became a form of currency inside the camp. But beneath this surface of routine survival, something greater was at work. The German guards, or goons, as the prisoners nicknamed them, believed they had created the perfect cage. But what they did not realize was that every fence, every guard tower, every roll call was being studied. The prisoners were not idle. They were engineers, strategists, and thinkers. They mapped the camp, measured distances, and recorded guard patrol times. They noticed that despite the camp's security, small weaknesses existed. And in those weaknesses, they found hope. By 1943, a secret network had formed within the camp. At its center was a determined leader, Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, a British officer who had already escaped twice before being recaptured. Bushell believed that small escapes were no longer enough. His vision was ambitious. A mass breakout involving hundreds of men, one so large it would overwhelm the German war machine. He proposed digging not one tunnel, but 3, each given a codename: Tom, Dick, and Harry. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. The Germans had built Stalag Luft III to be escape-proof. But the men inside were prepared to prove them wrong. Life inside Stalag Luft III was a strange mix of monotony, discipline, and quiet rebellion. For the prisoners, every day followed a routine set by the German guards. At dawn, the camp awoke to the sound of whistles and shouted orders. Roll call, known as appel, was mandatory. Hundreds of Allied officers lined up in the freezing cold or under the blazing summer sun, counted and inspected by guards. It was the Germans' way of reminding the men that they were under total control. But for the prisoners, even roll call was an opportunity, an extra minute to study guard routines, to observe weak points, or to test subtle tricks of deception. After roll call, the day settled into a rhythm. Meals were sparse and uninspiring. Watery soup, thin bread, the occasional slice of meat or potato. Without Red Cross parcels, many prisoners would have starved. These parcels, sent from neutral countries, were a lifeline, containing tins of powdered milk, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. Inside the wire, cigarettes became currency. A man could trade 2 for a bar of chocolate, or 10 for a pair of socks. This underground economy kept morale alive and taught the men to stretch every resource they had. The huts themselves were cramped wooden barracks, poorly insulated, with bunks stacked against the walls. Lice and fleas were a constant irritation. In winter, frost crept across the walls, and in summer the air was suffocating. Yet the men adapted. They built small stoves from scrap metal, crafted playing cards from cardboard, and even set up makeshift theaters. Within the camp, plays and concerts were staged with astonishing creativity. Costumes were sewn from blankets, scripts were handwritten, and music was played on smuggled instruments. For a few hours, prisoners could forget the barbed wire that surrounded them. Education also flourished. Many officers turned their time in captivity into a university behind barbed wire. Languages, history, mathematics, even engineering were taught in secret classrooms. Some men studied for real qualifications that would later help them after the war. Others simply used lessons as a way to keep their minds sharp, resisting the boredom and despair of captivity. But beneath this surface of routine life, something much more dangerous was happening. The prisoners were organizing, planning, and preparing. Every man had a role to play in the escape network. Some were penguins, men who carried bags of sand from tunnel digging and discreetly scattered it across the camp by shaking it out of their trousers. Others were forgers, creating fake identity papers and travel documents from scraps of paper and stolen ink. Tailors and cobblers worked in secret to make civilian clothes from blankets, uniforms, and whatever fabric they could find. Artists painted maps and recreated train tickets with astonishing accuracy. Each skill was vital to the larger plan. Security inside the camp was tight, but the guards, nicknamed goons by the prisoners, were constantly tested. Prisoners learned how to distract them during searches, how to signal when a patrol was approaching, and how to smuggle tools into the huts. Bed boards were removed to shore up tunnel walls, spoons and tin cans were reshaped into digging tools, and secret hiding places were carved out beneath floors and behind false walls. To the Germans, the camp looked orderly. To the prisoners, it was a hive of underground activity. Daily life also demanded secrecy. Escape planning was hidden behind layers of deception. While some men played sports or performed on stage, others were deep underground, digging in suffocating darkness with only candles for light. The tunnels, Tom, Dick, and Harry, were guarded by elaborate lookout systems. If a German guard approached, a coded cough or whistle would echo through the huts, warning the diggers to stop and hide their work. It was a system that relied on trust, discipline, and absolute teamwork. Despite the hardship, morale remained high. The men knew that every act of defiance, every forged document, every shovel of sand, every secret rehearsal of an escape plan, was a strike against the enemy. Life inside Stalag Luft III may have seemed ordinary from the outside. But beneath its surface, the camp pulsed with determination, ingenuity, and hope. Every prisoner lived with the same unspoken dream, not if they would escape, but when. By early 1943, life in Stalag Luft III had settled into a grinding routine. For many prisoners, days blurred into weeks, and weeks into months. But for one man, routine was the enemy. Squadron Leader Roger Bushell, known to his comrades as Big X, had already tried and failed to escape from German custody before. He knew the risks: capture, punishment, even execution, but his determination only hardened. To Bushell, escape was not simply about freedom. It was about duty, about disrupting the German war machine, and about proving that the Allies could not be broken. Bushell envisioned something far more ambitious than the usual one-two-man breakout. He wanted to overwhelm the system itself. His plan was staggering in scope: a mass escape of over 200 prisoners in a single night. If even a fraction of them succeeded, the Germans would be forced to divert thousands of troops, police, and resources to hunt them down, resources that would otherwise be used on the front lines of war. At a secret meeting inside one of the prisoner huts, Bushell laid out his audacious vision to the escape committee. His words electrified the men. 3 tunnels, dug simultaneously, in case one was discovered. They would be codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. If the Germans found one, the other 2 would continue. Each tunnel would be over 300 feet long, deep enough to avoid detection, and carefully reinforced with wooden boards stolen from bed slats. At the end of each tunnel, men would emerge into the surrounding forest under the cover of night. It was a plan so daring, so risky, that it seemed impossible. But within the wire, impossible was the only option left. The work began in silence, hidden beneath the floors of prisoner huts. Secret trapdoors were built under stoves, inside washrooms, even beneath the sand of outdoor exercise areas. The first challenge was digging. The soil of Stalag Luft III was sandy and unstable, collapsing easily under pressure. To prevent cave-ins, prisoners scavenged every scrap of wood they could find: bed boards, shelves, even stolen pieces of furniture. These were used to shore up the tunnel walls, one plank at a time. Soon, entire barracks had sagging roofs as men secretly dismantled them to keep the tunnels alive. Ventilation was another deadly obstacle. The deeper they dug, the more suffocating the air became. Ingenious prisoners designed makeshift air pumps using tins, clothing, and scavenged parts, pumping fresh oxygen down to the men working in the stifling dark. Electric lighting was also rigged, powered by stolen wire tapped into the camp's grid. In the flickering glow of tiny bulbs, men crawled on their stomachs through shafts barely wide enough to squeeze through, their hands raw from scraping sand into tin cans and buckets. But digging was only half the battle. Every bucket of sand had to be disposed of without the guards noticing. This was the work of the penguins. Prisoners carried bags of yellow sand hidden in the legs of their trousers. As they walked casually across the camp during exercise periods, they tugged on strings, releasing the sand little by little, scattering it into the soil. To anyone watching, it looked like a man strolling in the yard. In reality, tons of earth were disappearing under the Germans' noses. Secrecy was vital. Entire lookout networks were established. One cough, one whistle, one sudden song from a nearby hut could signal danger. When guards entered huts unexpectedly, Diggers froze in silence, candles extinguished, tools hidden. If a trapdoor was exposed, it was quickly covered with blankets, tables, or even a prisoner sitting casually on top. Discipline was absolute. Every man knew that one careless mistake could doom them all. Meanwhile, another army of prisoners worked above ground. Forgers painstakingly created fake documents, travel passes, ration cards, even military papers. Ink was made from boot polish and soot, stamps were carved from rubber, and German handwriting was studied until perfect imitations could be produced. Tailors worked just as feverishly, sewing civilian clothes from blankets and captured fabric. They created suits, jackets, and coats that would pass as authentic under dim lamplight at a railway station. Cobblers made shoes from scrap leather. Cartographers drew maps of Germany, Poland, and beyond, copied carefully from smuggled newspapers and radio broadcasts. Every man had a role: diggers, forgers, tailors, carpenters, or lookouts. It was a vast underground operation, orchestrated under the noses of the guards. Despite their careful planning, danger was constant. One day, while inspecting a hut, guards stumbled upon the entrance to Tunnel Tom. It was a crushing setback. The tunnel had taken months of backbreaking work. But instead of surrendering, the men redoubled their efforts on the remaining tunnels, Dick and Harry. To them, failure was only temporary. If one tunnel was lost, another would take its place. Life in Stalag Luft III now had two layers. On the surface, it was theater performances, lectures, and card games. But beneath the ground, by candlelight, a second world existed, one of grit, determination, and quiet defiance. By late 1943, Tunnel Harry had become the main hope. Stretching toward the woods beyond the wire, it snaked its way hundreds of feet under the camp, hidden from view, its walls reinforced with stolen wood, its air kept breathable by homemade pumps. Every day it grew longer, inch by inch, toward freedom. The onset of the escape plan transformed the camp. No longer were the men passive prisoners. They were builders, engineers, and conspirators in a daring rebellion. Every step, every shovel of sand, every forged pass was an act of war. The Great Escape was no longer just a dream. It was becoming reality. March 24, 1944. After more than a year of digging, planning, and preparation, the night had finally come. The men of Stalag Luft III knew they were about to attempt something that had never been done before: a mass breakout of over 200 prisoners, slipping beneath the wire and into the forests of Germany. To the guards, it was just another night. To the prisoners, it was the night of destiny. The escape committee had chosen a moonless night. Snow still covered the ground, and the air was bitterly cold. But darkness was their ally. Inside Hut 104, the entrance to Tunnel Harry was concealed beneath a stove. One by one, men crouched in silence, waiting for their turn to descend into the earth. At the head of the line were those with the best chances of survival, men who spoke fluent German, who had forged papers and convincing disguises. Behind them, dozens more waited with forged documents, maps, and civilian clothing stitched from blankets. The first man slid down into the tunnel, clutching a small candle. He crawled on his stomach, the passage barely wide enough to squeeze through. The air was damp, the walls lined with wooden boards to prevent collapse. For over 300 feet, the tunnel stretched beneath the ground. At its far end, a small vertical shaft led upward to a concealed exit, hidden beneath the snowy forest floor. But when the first escapee pushed open the trapdoor, a problem appeared. The tunnel was supposed to emerge deep inside the woods, beyond the reach of the searchlights. But the tunnel had come up short, just 30 feet from the edge of the forest. The escapees now faced an agonizing choice. They could abandon the plan, or they could risk crawling out into the open, exposed to the watchtowers and floodlights. They chose to go forward. Failure was not an option. At precisely 10:30 p.m., the first prisoner emerged from Tunnel Harry, brushing snow from his shoulders, and disappeared into the tree line. One by one, men followed. Inside the tunnel, the line in Hut 104 moved slowly. Each man took several minutes to crawl through the passage, their hearts pounding with every creak of the wooden supports above them. At the far end, a rope and pulley system helped lift men up the vertical shaft. Above ground, lookouts watched carefully for signs of guards, signaling when it was safe to run. Progress was painfully slow. At one point, the tunnel lights flickered as the electrical wiring failed, plunging men into darkness. Candles were lit, the work continued, but time was slipping away. The plan had been to get 200 men out by dawn. But by midnight, only a few dozen had made it into the forest. Inside the huts, tension mounted. Men waiting their turn whispered encouragement, tightened their makeshift disguises, and clutched forged documents close to their chests. Some had train tickets, some had maps to Switzerland, others planned to find food and shelter in villages. Each man carried not just hope for himself, but the burden of the operation's success. Every man who escaped meant German soldiers pulled from the front lines to hunt him down. By 1 a.m., over 50 men had reached the woods. Some melted into the night in pairs, while others struck out alone. Snow muffled their footsteps, but left betraying tracks behind them. Still, the escape continued. The tunnel was alive with movement, men pushing forward, crawling through damp soil, their breath fogging the narrow space. But then, disaster struck. Shortly after 5 a.m., as dawn approached, a German sentry noticed movement near the tunnel exit. A prisoner had emerged too slowly, and the snow around the opening was disturbed. Shouts rang out. A flare lit up the night sky, bathing the camp in blinding light. Machine guns opened fire. The alarm had been raised. Chaos erupted. Men still in the tunnel scrambled backward toward the huts. Others near the exit tried desperately to make it into the trees. The guards swarmed the area, rifles trained, dogs unleashed. Within minutes, the escape was over. Of the more than 200 men who had planned to flee, only 76 had actually made it out of the tunnel. At dawn, the scale of the breakout became clear. Guards stormed Hut 104, tearing apart the stove and wooden floorboards, discovering the trapdoor that had been so carefully concealed. Prisoners stood silently as German officers raged, shouting orders, preparing to launch a massive manhunt. Across Germany, the hunt for the escapees began. Roads, railways, and villages were flooded with soldiers, police, and Gestapo agents. Trains were searched, identities checked, patrols doubled. The men of the Great Escape had made it into the night, but now they faced the far greater challenge of survival in enemy territory. For those who remained inside the camp, the night was bittersweet. They had risked everything, and though many had failed to get out, they had defied the Germans in a way no one thought possible. They had proved that even in captivity, the spirit of resistance burned brightly. The Great Escape had begun. By dawn on March 25, 1944, the enormity of what had just happened gripped the German authorities. 76 Allied prisoners of war had escaped from what was supposed to be an escape-proof camp. It was one of the largest breakouts in history, and the Nazi regime was humiliated. Across Germany, a manhunt of unprecedented scale was unleashed. Thousands of soldiers, Gestapo agents, and local police units were mobilized. Checkpoints sprang up on every major road. Trains were stopped and searched, passengers interrogated, documents scrutinized. German citizens were ordered to report any suspicious activity. Posters warned civilians that aiding escapees was punishable by death. The hunt for the men of Tunnel Harry had begun, and it was relentless. For the prisoners who had reached the outside world, survival now depended on skill, luck, and disguise. Some dressed as laborers and tried to blend into the crowds at train stations. Others carried forged papers, hoping to pass as foreign workers. A few aimed for distant borders, Denmark, Switzerland, even Spain, dreaming of freedom beyond German lines. But the odds were stacked against them. The winter cold left tracks in the snow. Patrol dogs could pick up scents. And the German transport system was heavily monitored. Within days, many escapees were recaptured. Some were caught boarding trains, their accents giving them away. Others were arrested in villages when locals grew suspicious. A few were betrayed by informants seeking rewards. Slowly, the Gestapo's net tightened. Back at Stalag Luft III, the German investigation began immediately. Furious officers tore through huts, uncovering false walls, hidden forgeries, and the remains of stolen materials. The engineering marvel of Tunnel Harry was revealed in full, stretching hundreds of feet into the forest. For the Germans, it was not only a security failure but an insult to their authority. Adolf Hitler himself was briefed. Enraged, he initially ordered all 73 recaptured prisoners to be executed as a warning to others. His advisors persuaded him to reduce the number, but the decision remained brutal. 50 Allied officers were to be shot. The order was clear, and it came directly from the top. Over the next weeks, recaptured men were handed over to the Gestapo. They were told they were being transferred back to camp. Instead, they were driven to isolated locations, quiet woods, remote fields, country roadsides. There, without trial, without warning, they were executed. Their bodies were left or buried hastily. The Nazis reported their deaths as shot while trying to escape, but the truth was darker. It was one of the most blatant war crimes of the Second World War. Among those executed were officers from Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The men had risked everything for freedom, and instead of being treated under the rules of war, they were murdered in cold blood. The executions shocked even some within the German military. The Luftwaffe, who had once seen the Allied officers as worthy opponents, were horrified by the Gestapo's brutality. But no one dared defy Hitler's orders. In total, 73 of the 76 escapees were recaptured. 50 of them were executed. Only 3 men managed to make it to freedom: 2 Norwegians who reached Sweden, and 1 Dutchman who made it all the way to Spain. The rest were returned to captivity, devastated but unbroken in spirit. The aftermath of the executions left a scar across the Allied Air Force communities. At Stalag Luft III, word of the murders spread slowly, whispered from hut to hut. Shock turned to grief, and grief into quiet rage. The men who had once dreamed together of freedom now mourned their comrades. But even in their mourning, they held on to pride. The Great Escape had forced the Germans to divert massive resources, disrupted their war effort, and proved that Allied prisoners could never be subdued. When the war ended, justice was sought. The executions became the subject of war crimes trials at Nuremberg. Gestapo officers responsible for carrying out Hitler's orders were hunted down, arrested, and put on trial. Many were sentenced to death or long prison terms for their roles in the murders. The memory of the 50 men lived on, not only as a tragedy but as a testament to courage in the face of oppression. The investigation into the Great Escape revealed both the brilliance of the prisoners and the brutality of their captors. It showed the ingenuity, determination, and unity of men who refused to surrender their will to fight. And it exposed the cruelty of a regime that feared even unarmed men in captivity. The Great Escape was not simply an act of defiance. It became a symbol of sacrifice, of resistance, and of the enduring human spirit. The guns of war eventually fell silent in 1945. Nazi Germany collapsed, its leaders brought to trial, its crimes exposed to the world. But amid the ruins of Europe, the memory of Stalag Luft III and the men of the Great Escape endured. For the families of the 50 murdered officers, the news was devastating. Many had clung to the hope that their sons, husbands, or brothers had survived the escape. Instead, they were handed the harsh truth. Across Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, telegrams of condolence arrived, messages that confirmed the price of courage. Yet their sacrifice was not forgotten. In Allied countries, newspapers carried the story of the Great Escape, hailing the prisoners' audacity and bravery. Public opinion turned even further against the Nazi regime, and the outrage fueled the resolve to defeat it. The escape became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even behind barbed wire, men could fight back with ingenuity and defiance. At Stalag Luft III, the surviving prisoners carried on. They mourned, but they did not give up. The spirit of resistance remained alive until the war's end, when Allied forces finally liberated the camp. Many of those who had worked on Tunnel Harry survived to tell the tale, ensuring that the story of their comrades would never be silenced. In the years after the war, justice was pursued. The executions of the 50 officers were investigated in detail. British investigators tracked down Gestapo officials responsible for carrying out Hitler's orders. Trials were held, and many perpetrators were sentenced to death or imprisonment. The world recognized the murders not just as a breach of military conduct, but as war crimes, proof of a regime that had abandoned all sense of humanity. But beyond the trials and punishments, the legacy of the Great Escape lay in memory, in honor, and in inspiration. Memorials were erected across Europe. In the forests of Zagan, Poland, where Stalag Luft III once stood, a monument was raised to commemorate the 50. Each year, ceremonies are held to honor their courage. Veterans, families, and locals gather to lay wreaths, to speak their names, and to ensure that history remembers their sacrifice. For many, the Great Escape remains one of the defining stories of the Second World War. It is not only a tale of tunnels and forgeries, but of human determination, the refusal to accept captivity, the insistence on freedom, no matter the cost. The men of Stalag Luft III became legends not because they succeeded in reaching freedom, but because they dared to try. Their story has been told and retold, in books, in documentaries, and even in films. Generations have grown up hearing of the escape, of the ingenuity, the teamwork, and the ultimate sacrifice. And each retelling serves as a reminder that courage can shine even in the darkest of places, that dignity can be preserved even in chains, and that freedom is worth any struggle. As we look back now, we see not only the tragedy of 50 lives lost, but the endurance of their spirit. The Great Escape was more than a breakout. It was a statement, an act of defiance that echoed far beyond the fences of Stalag Luft III. Today, their legacy lives on, etched in stone memorials, in the hearts of their families, and in the conscience of all who value liberty. They were men who risked everything for the chance to breathe free air. Though most never reached the outside world, their story did. And in that story, they achieved a victory that no prison, no guard, no regime could ever contain. The story of the Great Escape is not one of failure, nor of victory alone. It is a story of men who refused to surrender their spirit, even when imprisoned behind barbed wire. Their courage was not measured only in distance traveled or fences crossed, but in their unbreakable will to resist. Today, the legacy of Stalag Luft III is remembered not in the tunnels that collapsed, nor in the fences that once stood tall, but in the values those men carried with them: duty, sacrifice, brotherhood, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. For the 50 who were taken from this world, we remember. For the 73 who were recaptured, we honor their struggle. And for the handful who finally reached freedom, we acknowledge the victory they carried for all. The Great Escape reminds us that history is not just about battles fought on open fields, but about the quiet defiance of men who would not be broken. Their story lives on, not only in memorials and monuments, but in every heart that values liberty over fear. As we fade from the past into the present, let us carry their memory with us. For as long as we remember, they are never truly gone. This has been The Great Escape.